The manila envelope landed on my desk with a soft thud, disrupting the peaceful monotony of my Tuesday morning at the Boston Globe. "Davidson wants you on this," said my editor. Frank Pearson, his weathered face revealing nothing as he tapped a nicotine-stained finger on the envelope. "Some old lady called our tip line for 3 weeks straight. Claims the church buried something nasty back in '59. Another abuse case?" I asked, already feeling the familiar weight of dread. Frank shook his head. "Different breed of darkness, according to her. Something about a hospice in western Massachusetts run by a Catholic seminary. She's dying pancreatic cancer and wants someone to document what happened before she goes." I was skeptical but intrigued. It was October 1997, and the Globe hadn't yet broken the major clergy abuse scandal that would later define us. But we'd heard enough whispers to know that the Catholic Church in New England had secrets worth uncovering. The woman's name was Margaret Holden, 74, residing in a modest apartment in Peatsfield. The hospice nurse who answered her phone explained that Margaret's lucid hours were unpredictable but promised to call when she was having a good day. 3 days later, I found myself sitting beside a hospital bed in a living room transformed into a makeshift medical ward. Margaret was small, nearly consumed by her bedding, but her eyes were startlingly alert, deep blue, unwavering, and filled with a determination that illness couldn't diminish. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I don't have much time left. What I'm about to tell you happened in 1959 at St. Augustine's Seminary. I was a young nurse there, just 23, working at their hospice wing." She paused, reaching for a glass of water. The tremor in her hand sent ripples across the surface. "There was a monk there, Brother Thomas Holt. He worked primarily with the dying, offering last rites and comfort. Everyone thought he was a saint, but I knew differently." Margaret's eyes drifted toward the window, where autumn leaves pirouetted down from a maple tree. "I discovered what he was doing by accident. I had forgotten my cardigan in the basement morgue one evening and went back after hours. What I saw," she faltered, her composure cracking for the first time. "Brother Thomas had arranged 3 bodies on stone tables. He was performing some kind of ritual with them." "What kind of ritual?" I asked, pen hovering over my notepad. "He had placed coins on their eyes and tongues. There were symbols drawn on their chests in ash. He was whispering in Latin, but not any church Latin I recognized from Mass. When he saw me, he wasn't startled or embarrassed. He smiled and said, 'They're just vessels now, Margaret. Empty vessels that need direction in darkness.'" She described how Brother Thomas had continued his work at the hospice for years, how patients under his care often died sooner than expected, how she had documented everything, reported it to the seminary leadership, only to be transferred to another facility without explanation. 2 months later, I read that Brother Thomas had been sent to a monastery in Vermont. The church buried it all. But I kept my records, my journals. "They're all there." She pointed to a worn leather suitcase in the corner. "I need someone to tell the truth before I die." As I left her apartment that afternoon, the leather suitcase heavy in my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just accepted more than an assignment. I'd taken on a burden that would change me forever. Back in my cramped apartment in Cambridge, I spread Margaret's materials across my kitchen table. The centerpiece was a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with neat cursive. I began reading entries from early 1959. February 12, 1959, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons passed today. Brother Thomas spent an unusual amount of time alone with the body before the funeral home arrived. When I entered to prepare documentation, the room smelled of incense and ash. He said it was to honor her passing, but church protocol includes no such ritual. March 4, 1959, Mr. James Wilson died unexpectedly tonight, diagnosed with pneumonia but showing improvement yesterday. Brother Thomas had been spending evenings reading to him from what he claimed was scripture. I glimpsed the book once. It wasn't a Bible. The text appeared much older, bound in dark leather with no visible title. As I continued reading, Margaret's entries grew increasingly disturbed. She described patients experiencing nightmares after Brother Thomas's visits, speaking of a man in black who sits beside them when they sleep. Several patients who had been stable suddenly deteriorated after Brother Thomas began attending to them regularly. The journal contained more than observations. Margaret had meticulously documented death rates at the hospice, showing a 38% increase in mortality during the overnight shifts when Brother Thomas worked alone. She'd even included a crude floor plan of the basement morgue, marking the specific room where she had witnessed the ritual. Most disturbing were the photographs, grainy black and white images taken with what must have been a hidden camera. They showed a tall, gaunt man in traditional Catholic monk's garb standing over bodies arranged in particular positions. The images were taken from a distance and partially obscured, but clear enough to see that something deeply inappropriate was occurring. A separate folder contained Margaret's correspondence with seminary officials. Her initial letters expressed concern in carefully measured tones. Their responses were dismissive, suggesting she was overworked and imagining things. Her later letters grew more insistent, detailing specific incidents and dates. These went unanswered until a final letter informed her of her transfer to St. Mary's Hospital in Springfield, effective immediately. I found newspaper clippings about the seminary from 1960, including a small notice that Brother Thomas Holt had been reassigned to a contemplative order in Vermont. After years of devoted service to the infirm and dying, the article praised his compassion and spiritual guidance. Most chilling was an envelope containing death certificates of patients who had died under suspicious circumstances. Margaret had obtained copies through her position, noting inconsistencies between the official causes of death and the symptoms she had observed. As midnight approached, I found myself unable to continue. The weight of what I was reading, the systematic abuse of the dying and dead, the institutional cover-up, the silencing of the one person who tried to speak out, felt suffocating in my small apartment. I poured myself a whiskey, hands slightly trembling. Whatever Brother Thomas had been doing in that basement wasn't just a violation of medical ethics or religious protocols, was something deeply, fundamentally wrong. And the church had buried it, just as Margaret claimed. Tomorrow I decided I would drive to Peatsfield to visit the seminary. I needed to see the place for myself before proceeding further with the story. The 3-hour drive to western Massachusetts gave me time to organize my thoughts. St. Augustine's Seminary still operated, though the hospice wing had closed in 1972. According to public records, the property sprawled across 40 acres of woodland, the main buildings constructed in the 1920s in Gothic Revival style. As I turned off the main highway, a sign marked the entrance: St. Augustine's Seminary for Boys, forming young men in Christ's image since 1923. The driveway wound through dense pine forest before opening to a view that momentarily took my breath away. The main building loomed against the October sky, its stone facade darkened by decades of New England weather. Tall, narrow windows reflected the afternoon sunlight, giving the impression of watchful eyes. A bell tower rose from the center, crowned by a large cross that cast a long shadow across the front courtyard. I had called ahead, requesting an interview about the seminary's history for a feature on religious education in Massachusetts. The receptionist had seemed hesitant, but eventually arranged for me to meet with Father Lawrence Mackenzie, the current director. Father Mackenzie greeted me in the main hall, a man in his 60s with a trim white beard and wire-rimmed glasses. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "We don't get many journalists interested in seminary history these days," he said, leading me through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced priests. "Most people seem to think religious education is becoming irrelevant." I made appropriate comments about preserving tradition while taking mental notes of the layout. The interior was impressive, but showed signs of age-water stains on some ceilings, worn carpeting in less visible areas. The seminary clearly wasn't flush with cash. "I'm particularly interested in the hospice that operated here until the 70s, I said casually as we entered his office. It was quite innovative for its time, combining medical care with spiritual comfort. Father Mackenzie's smile remained fixed, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Yes, the hospice served the community for many years. However, changes in medical regulations made it impractical to continue. Would you like some tea?" As he busied himself with an electric kettle, I noticed a large floor plan of the seminary mounted on his wall. I approached it, scanning for the basement level Margaret had described. "Fascinating architecture," I commented. "Does the original basement level still exist?" The teacup rattled slightly as he set it down. "Parts of the basement have been sealed off due to structural concerns. Nothing of interest down there, I assure you. Mostly old storage and utility rooms." We spoke for another 30 minutes about the seminary's curriculum and history. Father Mackenzie was cordial but guarded, deflecting questions about specific past staff members and directing the conversation toward current programs. When I mentioned Brother Thomas Holt in passing, he claimed no knowledge of the name, despite having been at the seminary himself since the mid-1970s. As our interview concluded, I asked to use the restroom. He directed me down the hall, and once out of sight, I took a calculated risk. Instead of turning right toward the facilities, I found a service stairwell and descended. The basement level was dimly lit, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and the air heavy with the smell of mildew. Most doors were labeled maintenance, boiler room, archives. I moved quickly, comparing the layout to Margaret's crude map. The far corridor should have led to the old morgue, but when I reached it, I found a brick wall where a doorway should have been. The brickwork was newer than the surrounding walls, perhaps 20 or 30 years old at most. I was examining it when a voice behind me made me start. "This area is off limits to visitors." I turned to find a young seminarian watching me with suspicious eyes. "I got lost looking for the restroom," I offered lamely. "Up 2 flights and to the right," he said, making no move to leave until I started walking toward the stairs. As I drove back to Boston that evening, one thing was clear. Whatever had happened in that basement, the seminary had gone to considerable lengths to erase its physical traces. But Margaret's documentation provided a paper trail that couldn't be so easily erased. The monastery where Brother Thomas had been transferred was located near Burlington, Vermont, Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy, a cloistered Trappist community known for its contemplative tradition and vow of silence. My calls to the monastery went unanswered, which wasn't surprising given their limited contact with the outside world. I decided to approach from another angle. The Burlington Free Press archives might contain information about Brother Thomas's arrival or activities in the area. I called an old journalism school friend, Sarah Donovan, who now worked for the paper. "Thomas Holt?" she repeated after I explained my request. "Name doesn't ring any bells, but let me dig through our archives." "When did you say he arrived?" "1960. 2 days later," Sarah called back. "Found something interesting, though not much about your brother Thomas directly. In December 1960, there was a small notice about a monk joining Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy. No name mentioned, just that he came from Massachusetts. Anything else?" I pressed. "Well, here's where it gets interesting. In 1963, there was a local controversy about unusual nighttime activities at the monastery. Neighbors reported chanting after midnight and lights in the old cemetery on the grounds. The monastery issued a statement saying they were conducting traditional prayer vigils for deceased brothers. Any mention of Brother Thomas specifically? No, but she paused. In February 1965, there was an obituary for a Thomas Holt, described as a devoted servant of God who found his calling in ministering to souls transitioning from this world to the next. He died of natural causes at age 47. This was unexpected. If Brother Thomas had died in 1965, that significantly narrowed my investigation. But something about the timing felt too convenient. "Can you send me everything you have?" I asked. "Already did. Check your email. And Michael, be careful with this one. Something feels off about it." The files from Sarah contained one additional item of interest, a small human interest piece from 1964, about a local artist who had been commissioned to create sculptures for several religious institutions. In a photograph accompanying the article, the artist stood in his workshop surrounded by clay models. In the background, partially blurred, was a tall, thin man in monk's clothing. The caption didn't identify him, but the gaunt face matched the figure in Margaret's photographs. I called the Burlington County Records Office next, requesting any death certificate for Thomas Holt from 1965. The clerk found nothing. According to official records, no one by that name had died in Vermont that year. Something wasn't adding up. I needed to visit the monastery myself. The drive to Burlington took nearly 4 hours. Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy stood on a hillside overlooking Lake Champlain, surrounded by a high stone wall. A simple wooden sign indicated visiting hours, Sundays only, 1 to 3 p.m. for family members of the brothers. Today was Thursday. I parked along the road and walked the perimeter, noting a small cemetery within the walls, visible through the wrought iron gate. Approximately 30 simple crosses marked graves, arranged in neat rows. As I stood contemplating my next move, an elderly man approached, walking a golden retriever along the monastery road. He nodded in greeting. "You family to one of the brothers?" he asked. "Not exactly," I admitted. "I'm researching someone who was here in the 1960s, Brother Thomas." "Holt." The man's weathered face registered recognition. "The night monk," he said, surprising me. "Night monk?" He shrugged. "That's what locals called him. Only ever saw him after dark. Used to walk the cemetery paths for hours. My father said he talked to the dead more than the living." "Did you know him personally?" "Nobody did. The brothers don't interact much with outsiders, but even among themselves, that one kept apart. There were stories, ... double quotes," he trailed off, glancing at the monastery walls. "What kind of stories?" I pressed. He seemed to debate whether to continue, then lowered his voice despite no one else being around. "Some said he brought practices with him that WEREN single quotes T ... right. Catholic, I mean. Old things. My aunt cleaned for the monastery once a week. She said she found strange symbols drawn in ash in the chapel basement once. When she mentioned it to the abbot, she was told not to return." "When did he die?" I read it was 1965. The man's face clouded. "That's what they said. But my father swore he saw him walking the cemetery wall a year later. The official story was that he's buried there." He nodded toward the cemetery. "But if you ask me, that grave's empty." As the man continued his walk, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Whether Brother Thomas had died in 1965 or not, his shadow seemed to linger here, just as it did in Margaret's memories. Back in Boston, I focused on the purported death of Brother Thomas. If I could prove the obituary was fabricated, that the church had created a paper trail of his death while relocating him elsewhere, it would strengthen the case that they were covering up serious misconduct. I requested all available information on deaths at Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy Monastery between 1964 and 1966 from the Vermont Department of Health's Vital Records Division. The response arrived 3 days later during that period. Only one death had been recorded at the monastery, Father William Sullivan, age 82, natural causes. No Thomas Holt. Next, I contacted the Diocese of Burlington, claiming to be researching my great-uncle's connection to the monastery. The church secretary was helpful but found no record of a Brother Thomas Holt ever being assigned there. According to their records, no monk by that name had served in any capacity within the diocese. It was as if the man had been systematically erased. I returned to Margaret's materials, meticulously reviewing every document for additional clues. In her final journal, I found an entry I had initially overlooked, June 17, 1960. Received a strange letter today. No return address. Postmarked Rome. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Brother Thomas's reassignment and a single line of text. Some vessels should remain empty. The handwriting resembles Brother Thomas's, though I cannot be certain. Rome. If Brother Thomas had connections to the Vatican, it would explain the thorough nature of his disappearance from records. I called Dr. Elena Russo, a colleague from my reporting days in Washington, who now worked as a religious studies professor specializing in Vatican history. It's possible he was reassigned directly by Rome, she said after hearing my findings. In cases where the church wants someone to disappear quietly, they have facilities, remote monasteries in Italy, Spain, even South America, where problematic clergy can be sent without local diocesan involvement. So he might not have died at all, I suggested. Possibly. The church has occasionally used administrative deaths, declaring someone deceased in public records while relocating them as a management tool for sensitive cases. What kind of sensitive cases would warrant that level of intervention? Elena hesitated. Traditionally, 3 categories: serious moral failings that would damage the church's reputation if made public, heresy or significant doctrinal deviation, or involvement with practices considered occult or demonic. And rituals involving the dead? That would depend on the nature of the rituals, she said carefully. Catholic tradition includes prayers for the dead, but anything involving manipulation of corpses would be strictly forbidden. It would be considered desecration, possibly linked to necromancy communication with the dead, which the church explicitly condemns. I thanked Elena and hung up, mulling over this information. The pieces were beginning to align. Brother Thomas conducting unauthorized rituals with the dead, the church discovering this practice. A fabricated reassignment followed by a fabricated death. Records systematically purged. But questions remained. What exactly was Brother Thomas doing? Was it simply a case of unorthodox religious practices, or something more sinister? And most importantly, why would the Vatican intervene at such a high level for a seemingly obscure monk in western Massachusetts? I needed to speak with Margaret again, to ask questions I hadn't known to ask during our first meeting. But when I called her apartment, the hospice nurse informed me that Margaret had taken a sudden turn for the worse. She was now in the hospital and unlikely to regain consciousness. The window for getting answers directly from my only witness was closing rapidly. With Margaret unavailable, I needed to find alternative sources to understand the Vatican's involvement. My search led me to Father Richard Donovan, a retired priest now teaching theology at Boston College. He'd spent 15 years working in the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the modern name for what was once called the Holy Office, or historically the Inquisition. We met at a quiet cafe near campus. Father Donovan appearing every inch the scholarly priest in his clerical collar and tweed jacket, with wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. "This Brother Thomas," he said after I explained my investigation. "Keeping the details vague, you believe Rome intervened directly in his case? That's what the evidence suggests. I'm trying to understand why they would go to such lengths over one monk's unorthodox practices." Father Donovan sipped his espresso, considering. "During the period you're describing, the late 1950s and early 60s, Cha was particularly sensitive to any hint of what they called modern paganism infiltrating Catholic practice." Modern paganism? After World War II, there was concern about various occult and esoteric practices that had gained popularity in certain intellectual circles. Some of these involved death rituals adapted from ancient traditions, Egyptian, Greek, even pre-Christian European practices. He leaned forward slightly. In 1958, Pope Pius XII died and John XXIII was elected. The transition created a brief period of, let's call it doctrinal uncertainty within certain offices of the Vatican. Some traditionalists feared the new pope might be too progressive, too willing to accommodate modern influences. How does this connect to Brother Thomas? I'm speculating, but if this monk was practicing rituals that blended Catholic last rites with elements from other traditions, it would have been seen as particularly dangerous during this transitional period. The Church might have viewed him not as a simple case of individual misconduct, but as a symptom of broader doctrinal contamination. Father Donovan paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. Finally, he said, there was a particular office within the Holy Office then officially dissolved during Vatican II reforms called the Concilium de Mortuis, the Council on the Dead. They specifically oversaw cases involving improper treatment of human remains or unauthorized rituals concerning death. I've never heard of this council, I said. Few have. Their records were sealed in the secret archives, but they were particularly active between 1945 and 1965. Investigating cases throughout Europe and the Americas where Catholic clergy or institutions were alleged to have engaged in non-canonical practices involving the dead or dying. This was the first concrete connection between Brother Thomas's activities and direct Vatican intervention. If the Concilium de Mortuis had been involved in his case, it would explain the thorough erasure of records and the apparent high-level management of his disappearance. What happened to people investigated by this council? I asked. Father Donovan's expression grew somber. It varied. Some were simply reassigned to remote locations. Others underwent what was euphemistically called spiritual rehabilitation, essentially a form of religious reprogramming. The most serious cases... Bell quotes, he hesitated. Yes, the most serious cases were sometimes committed to certain specialized facilities, not exactly prisons, but not unlike them either. Places where those deemed spiritually dangerous could be contained without public knowledge. And these facilities still exist? Some do, though their purpose has officially changed. There's one in northern Italy near Turin that once housed such cases. Monastery of St. Peregrine. If your brother Thomas was considered a serious enough threat, that's where he might have been sent. As our conversation concluded, Father Donovan offered one final thought. Whatever this man did, Mr. Patterson, the Church believed it serious enough to effectively erase him from history. That suggests something beyond simple misconduct or doctrinal error. Be careful in your pursuit of this story. Some doors once opened cannot be easily closed again. His warning stayed with me as I left the cafe, the autumn evening settling over Boston like a shroud. That night I received a call from the hospice nurse caring for Margaret. She's asking for you, the nurse said, her voice low. She's had a brief rally. It happens sometimes near the end. If you want to speak with her again, I suggest you come quickly. I drove to Peatsfield Memorial Hospital through a light October rain, arriving just after midnight. The night shift nurse directed me to the palliative care unit, where I found Margaret looking significantly worse than during our first meeting. Her skin had a grayish tint and her breathing was shallow and labored, but her eyes remained clear, fixed on me as I entered. You found something, she said, not a question but a statement, about Brother Thomas. I pulled a chair close to her bed and summarized my discoveries. The falsified death record, the Vatican connection, the possibility that Brother Thomas had been sent to a specialized facility in Italy. She listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding slightly. When I finished, she reached for something on her bedside table, a small, worn leather pouch. I didn't give you everything before, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't believe me, that you'd think I was just a confused old woman. She handed me the pouch. Inside, I found a tarnished silver medallion about 2 inches in diameter. One side bore an intricate symbol, a vertical line intersected by 3 horizontal lines of different lengths, surrounded by what appeared to be Latin text too worn to decipher. The other side showed a stylized chalice with what looked like flames rising from it. I took this from Brother Thomas's room after he was gone, Margaret explained. It had fallen behind his dresser. I didn't know what it was then, but I knew it was important. I've kept it all these years. Do you know what it means? I asked, turning the medallion in my hand. No, but there's something else you should know. She paused, gathering strength. Brother Thomas wasn't working alone. There were others, at different institutions, in different cities. I overheard him once on the telephone in the administrator's office. He was speaking Italian, but I recognized a few words. He mentioned brothers in Philadelphia and the work continuing. You think this was organized? A network? She nodded weakly. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't just one man's aberration. It was systematic, and the Church knew. Margaret's eyes drifted closed, her energy clearly fading. The nurse appeared in the doorway, gesturing that I should wrap up. One last thing, Margaret said, her eyes opening again with visible effort. After they transferred me, strange things happened. My apartment was broken into, but nothing was taken. I received phone calls, no one speaking, just silence on the line. Once I found a dead bird on my doorstep with a coin in its beak. They were watching me, warning me. Who? The church. Someone connected to Brother Thomas. I stopped talking about what I'd seen after that. But I never stopped watching, listening, collecting evidence. Her hand closed weakly around mine. Promise me you'll tell the whole story. No matter what happens, I promised. And as I left the hospital with the medallion heavy in my pocket, I knew I was now irreversibly committed to uncovering the truth, whatever the consequences. Margaret Holden died 2 days later. According to the hospice nurse, she went peacefully in her sleep. I attended her funeral, a small affair with only a handful of mourners, mostly former colleagues from her nursing days. As I stood at the back of the chapel, I couldn't help but feel that her death marked not the end of a story, but the passing of a burden from her shoulders to mine. The medallion became my new focus. I photographed it from multiple angles and began searching for matches or similar symbols. This led me to Dr. Abigail Wright, an anthropologist at Harvard specializing in religious iconography. Dr. Wright examined the medallion in her cluttered office, surrounded by artifacts from various world religions. After studying it through a magnifying glass, she placed it carefully on a velvet cloth between us. "This is unusual," she said, tapping the symbol with a slender finger. "The vertical line intersected by 3 horizontals is reminiscent of certain medieval Catholic symbols representing the Trinity, but this configuration is non-standard." She turned it over. "The chalice with flames is more interesting. It appears similar to iconography associated with certain heterodox Catholic sects that emerged in Southern Europe during the Counter-Reformation. They were particularly focused on the moment of death and the transition of the soul. Could it be connected to rituals involving the dead?" I asked. "These groups believed that death was not an instantaneous event but a process, that the soul remained connected to the body for a period after clinical death. They developed elaborate rituals to guide the soul to its proper destination." Were these groups considered heretical? By the official church, absolutely. They were systematically suppressed during the 17th and 18th centuries. Most historians believe they died out completely by the 19th century. Dr. Wright's expression grew thoughtful. "Where'd you get this?" "It appears quite old, but some elements suggest it might be a more recent recreation of an ancient design." I gave her a simplified version of my investigation, mentioning only that it was connected to unusual practices at a Catholic hospice in the 1950s. She listened with academic interest. "The Latin inscription is worn, but I can make out fragments," she said, returning to the medallion. "It appears to say Custos animarum in tenebris, guardian of souls in darkness." This reinforces my impression that it's connected to transition rituals. What exactly would these rituals have involved? Historically, various elements, positioning of the body in specific ways to open the pathways for the soul. Placement of objects like coins on bodily apertures, eyes, mouths, sometimes ears, to seal them against malevolent forces. Invocations to guide the soul through what was conceptualized as a dangerous landscape between life and afterlife. This matched precisely what Margaret had described seeing Brother Thomas do. In their original context, Dr. Wright continued, these practices weren't necessarily malevolent. They represented a sincere belief in helping the dead. However, some versions included concerning elements. The belief that the practitioner could extract information or power from the transitioning soul, or that they could influence its destination. Would the modern church consider such practices evil? Unquestionably. They contradict fundamental Catholic doctrine about death and salvation. More concerning from the church's perspective would be the implication that an individual practitioner could intervene in a process they believe should be solely between the soul and God. As I left Dr. Wright's office with the medallion securely back in my possession, the pieces were coming together. Brother Thomas appeared to have been practicing resurrection rituals derived from heterodox Catholic traditions, rituals the official church had supposedly stamped out centuries ago. The Vatican's extreme response effectively erasing him from existence suggested that his case represented something more significant than one monk's heretical practices. But I still didn't understand the full scope. Margaret had mentioned others in Philadelphia and elsewhere. How widespread was this network, and what exactly were they trying to accomplish with these death rituals? Following Margaret's clue about Philadelphia, I contacted an investigative reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer whom I'd met at a journalism conference years earlier. Without divulging all the details, I asked if she could check their archives for any unusual incidents involving Catholic hospices or hospitals in the late 1950s or early 1960s. 3 days later, she sent me a package containing photocopies of several articles. One immediately caught my attention, a small piece from 1961 about a nurse at St. Francis Hospice who had been dismissed after making unfounded accusations against a visiting chaplain. The nurse, Ruth Collins, had claimed the chaplain was conducting improper rituals with deceased patients. The article quoted a hospital administrator dismissing the allegations as the imaginings of an overworked mind and noting that the chaplain in question had already been reassigned to another diocese. No name was provided for the chaplain. After several phone calls, I located Ruth Collins, now living in a retirement community in New Jersey. She was initially reluctant to speak with me, but when I mentioned Margaret Holden's name and explained that she had recently passed away, Ruth agreed to meet. The retirement community was a pleasant campus of modest apartments surrounded by carefully maintained gardens. Ruth, now 78, welcomed me into a sun-filled living room decorated with photographs of children and grandchildren. Unlike Margaret, she appeared to be in good health, though her hands shook slightly as she poured tea. "I haven't spoken about this in decades," she said, settling into an armchair across from me. "After what happened at St. Francis, I learned to keep quiet. But if Margaret finally told her story, perhaps it's time I told mine." Ruth's experience paralleled Margaret's in disturbing ways. In 1961, a visiting priest who called himself Father Martin had begun working with terminal patients at St. Francis Hospice. Like Brother Thomas, he was initially praised for his dedication to the dying. And like Brother Thomas, Ruth had accidentally discovered him performing unusual rituals with the recently deceased. He would arrange them in specific positions, she recalled, her voice steady despite the disturbing content. Arms crossed over the chest, but with the right hand holding a small object, I think it was a coin or medallion. He placed similar objects on their eyes and in their mouths. There were markings on their foreheads and chests drawn in what looked like ash. "Did you report what you saw?" I asked, immediately. "To the hospital administrator, then to the diocese when he dismissed my concerns. 2 weeks later, I was fired for professional misconduct, supposedly mishandling medications, though there had never been any issues with my work before." Father Martin disappeared around the same time. I later heard he'd been sent to Rome for advanced studies. "Did you ever see this?" I asked, showing her the medallion. Her face paled as she took it, fingers trembling more noticeably. "Yes, Father Martin wore one on a chain under his clothes. I saw it once when he was leaning over a patient." "Where did you get this?" I explained about Margaret and Brother Thomas. Ruth nodded slowly. They were connected somehow, these men. Father Martin occasionally received letters with Italian stamps. Once, I overheard him on the phone mentioning our brother in Massachusetts and something about the preparations, continuing as planned. "Did you ever understand what they were trying to accomplish with these rituals?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "I had a theory, though it seemed far-fetched even to me. Father Martin was obsessed with the moment of death. He would sit with patients for hours as they were dying, whispering to them, watching them intently. It was as if he was trying to capture something at that moment. Something he believed happened when the soul left the body. Like what? I don't know exactly. But after one elderly man died, I heard Father Martin say, 'Not this one either.' The vessel was too weak. It was chilling, as if the patients were just containers to him. Vessels for something he was seeking. Before leaving, I asked Ruth if she had ever experienced any intimidation after her dismissal, similar to what Margaret had described. She hesitated, then nodded. For several months afterward, I felt watched. My apartment was broken into once, though nothing valuable was taken. And I received a package. No return address, containing a small cloth pouch. Inside was a bird's skull with a coin in its beak. I threw it away immediately and moved to a different neighborhood the following month. The pattern was unmistakable. 2 nurses in different cities, both witnessing nearly identical rituals performed by Catholic clergy with dying and deceased patients. Both silenced through professional dismissal. Both experiencing similar intimidation afterward. And both men, Brother Thomas and Father Martin, disappearing into the church hierarchy, their records effectively erased. This was no longer a story about one monk's heretical practices. It pointed to an organized network operating within Catholic healthcare facilities, conducting systematic rituals with the dying and deed rituals the Vatican had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. As I prepared to write my article, I needed to verify one final connection. If Brother Thomas had indeed been sent to the monastery of St. Peregrine near Turin, as Father Donovan had suggested, finding evidence of his presence there would solidify the Vatican's direct involvement in the case. I contacted an Italian journalist I had worked with during my time covering the European financial crisis. Marco Risi had connections throughout Italy, including sources within the Vatican. I shared the essential details of my investigation, emphasizing the historical angle to avoid raising immediate alarms. 2 weeks passed before Marcos's response arrived, a brief email with an attachment. Found something. Official visitor log from Monastery of St. Peregrine, 1966, 1967. See entry from December 14, 1966. Be careful with this, my friend. My source took significant risk. The attachment contained a scanned page from a handwritten visitor log. Most entries were mundane church officials, delivery notations, maintenance records, but the entry from December 14, 1966, stood out. American subject transferred to Sector C, order from Consilium de Mortuis, file reference TH592US, containment protocol level 3, TH592US. Thomas Holt, the 592nd case from the United States. This was the final peace confirmation that Brother Thomas hadn't died in Vermont, as the obituary claimed, but had been transferred to a specialized containment facility in Italy, by direct order of the Vatican Council Father Donovan had mentioned. With this evidence in hand, I began drafting my article for the Boston Globe, a comprehensive investigation linking Brother Thomas's activities in Massachusetts to Father Martin's in Philadelphia, documenting the Church's systematic cover-up and revealing the existence of what appeared to be a network of clergy performing unauthorized rituals with the dying and dead across multiple Catholic healthcare facilities. Before submitting the piece, I sent a detailed letter to the Archdiocese of Boston outlining my findings and requesting comment. Their response was swift, a phone call from the Archdiocese attorney requesting an immediate meeting. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Archdiocese administrative offices. Present were 2 attorneys, a senior church official introduced only as Father James from the Cardinal's office, and surprisingly, Father Richard Donovan, who had previously spoken with me about the Vatican's Consilium de Mortuis. The discussion was tense but cordial. The church representatives acknowledged that there had been isolated cases of liturgical impropriety in the past, but insisted that characterizing it as a network was grossly misleading. They offered limited confirmation of Brother Thomas's reassignment while disputing my conclusions about Vatican involvement. When I produced the visitor log from St. Peregrine, the mood in the room shifted perceptibly. The attorneys exchanged glances, and Father James asked how I had obtained the document. I declined to reveal my source. After a brief private consultation, they returned with a proposal. If I agreed to delay publication while they conducted their own internal investigation, they would provide access to certain church records that would clarify the historical context of my findings. It was clearly a stalling tactic, but it also suggested they had more information they weren't sharing. I agreed to a 2-week delay, with the understanding that I would publish regardless of their findings once that period elapsed. 3 days later, while working late in my apartment, I heard a knock at the door. Standing outside was Father Donovan, alone, looking nervous. "I shouldn't be here," he said as I invited him in, "but you need to understand what you're dealing with before you publish." Over the next hour, he revealed what he knew. The men Margaret and Ruth had encountered, Brother Thomas, Father Martin, and others, had indeed been part of an organized group within the church. They called themselves the Custodias, Animarum Guardians of Souls, a revival of one of the heterodox sects Dr. Wright had mentioned in connection with the medallion. According to Father Donovan, they believed they could extract spiritual energy from the dying, collecting it through specific rituals performed at the moment of death and immediately afterward. This energy, they claimed, could be used for various purposes: healing, influence over others, even extending their own lives. It wasn't simply heresy, Father Donovan explained. The church viewed it as a form of vampirism, feeding on the spiritual essence of the vulnerable. That's why the response was so absolute, so secretive. How widespread was this? I asked. More than the church will ever admit publicly. Cells were identified in at least 7 countries between 1955 and 1965. The Vatican created the Consilium de Mortuis specifically to address the threat. Most of the practitioners were contained or neutralized. Neutralized? Father Donovan's expression was grim. I can't speak to specific methods, but the church has centuries of experience dealing with internal threats. When rehabilitation fails, there are alternatives. He rose to leave, pausing at the door. They'll never confirm any of this officially. The documents you've seen are a fraction of what exists, but even those will likely disappear now that you've alerted them to your investigation. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because the truth matters, he said simply, and because some of these men may still be out there. The church believed they had eliminated the Custodies by the early 1970s, but there were always rumors of survivors, of the practice continuing in secret. After Father Donovan left, I sat in my darkened apartment, weighing my next steps. Publishing the full story would likely result in immediate legal challenges from the church. The evidence I had, while compelling, consisted largely of decades old accounts and documents obtained through questionable channels. Yet Margaret's final request echoed in my mind. Promise me you'll tell the whole story, no matter what happens. I completed my article the following morning, documenting everything I had discovered: the rituals, the cover-up, the Vatican's intervention, and the existence of the Custodes Animarum. I included photographs of the medallion and copies of the documents Margaret had preserved, along with transcripts of my interviews with Ruth Collins and others. Before submitting it, I made digital copies of all my evidence and mailed them to multiple colleagues at other newspapers with instructions to publish if anything happened to me. It seemed melodramatic, but Father Donovan's warnings and the experiences of Margaret and Ruth suggested caution was warranted. The Boston Globe published my investigation as a 3-part series in December 1997. The response was immediate and intense. The Archdiocese issued a formal denial, dismissing the story as sensationalist journalism based on unreliable accounts and misinterpreted documents. Other Catholic organizations followed suit, but something unexpected happened as well. Within days of publication, I began receiving emails and letters from people across the country, former hospice workers, hospital staff, and family members of deceased patients, all describing similar experiences. Unusual rituals performed with the dying, clergy members who showed unusual interest in the moment of death, coins placed on eyes and tongues, symbols drawn in ash. Some of these accounts dated back to the 1950s, but others were more recent, from the 1980s and even the early 1990s. The pattern was unmistakable. Whatever the Church had tried to eliminate decades earlier had survived, adapting and continuing its practices in more subtle ways. 3 months after the story broke, the Vatican announced a special commission to investigate historical allegations of liturgical impropriety in healthcare settings. It was a carefully worded acknowledgement that stopped well short of confirming my findings, but represented an unprecedented response to journalistic pressure. Margaret Holden never lived to see the impact of her courage, but her determination to expose the truth had finally borne fruit. Brother Thomas's rituals in that seminary basement and the Church's efforts to bury them had been brought into the light after nearly 40 years of darkness. Yet questions remain. What became of Brother Thomas after his transfer to St. Peregrine? Did the rituals of the Custodes Animarum achieve anything beyond violating the dignity of the dead? And most troublingly, if reports from the 1980s and 90s are accurate, who carries on their work today, moving among the dying in hospitals and hospices, waiting for that moment when they believe the soul leaves the body, becoming, in Brother Thomas's words, an empty vessel that needs direction in darkness? The full truth remains, buried in Vatican archives, in memories fading with age, and perhaps in graves marked with symbols few would recognize or understand. But some secrets refuse to stay buried forever.